Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Livable Roadways meeting. My name is Joseph Citro, and I am chairing it today. If I could ask everybody to please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation. Thank you. We didn't have our flag up, but that's okay.
I was trying and sorry. All right.
I have one in my office. All right, let's have roll call, please.
All right. Joseph Citro,
I'm here.
Cal Hardy or Danny Jorgensen?
He's here.
Can y'all hear?
Okay.
I'm here. Can y'all hear me?
Yes. Now we can.
Sorry, I was looking for the mute button.
Una Johnson,
She's excused.
Julie Ham, Mark Hudson, Michael Marino,
Here.
Melissa Colazzo, David Hay.
Melissa's here. She just might be having.
Sorry,
meeting
I'm
issues.
here. Just it hides
Okay.
the mute button for some reason.
David Hay,
Here.
Emily Hinsdale, Karen Cashin,
Present.
Larry Josephson, Karen
Oh.
Kress,
I'm here.
Matt Lewis,
I'm here.
Justin Willits,
Here.
Roger Menendez or Casey Dagenhart.
Present, Roger.
All right. Jason Jackman,
Present.
Arizona Jenkins, Carlos Ramirez, Ray Mensa or Sarah Hendricks,
Here.
Anna Quinones,
Hi, I'm here.
Gus Ignis, Sandra Picciarelli, I believe she's here.
Yeah, she's here. She just might be having.
And then last, Matthew Pleasant.
Here.
And that's it.
And then a correction. Now, Una is here.
Okay.
So please count her present.
Okay, that's the end of the roll call.
And I'm pretty sure we're at quorum, just in case.
We are,
Yes.
for the record.
Oh, and then I see Mark Hudson is here now, so I'm moving him over as a panelist. So please count him present.
Okay, yeah, we do have a quorum.
Thank you. Just needed that for the record. I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes from March 24th, 2021 meeting.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
this is Roger Menendez. I was on the call yesterday last week, pardon me. And somehow I was missed. I apologize.
Okay.
I will entertain a motion for amended minutes from March 24th, 2021.
Karen Kress, so moved.
Second, Michael Marino.
Motion by Karen Kress, seconded by Michael Marino. All in favor, just say aye or a or yes or.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much.
Aye.
All right, let's move into our, we're not going to have, I do not believe we're going to have any voting today. So let's move into our agenda items, discussion items. Let's start with Ms. Paula Flores from MUTCD. Ms. Flores, are you on the line?
I am on the line.
Okay.
Good morning to you, Ms. Paula.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Am I able to share the screen?
Yes, let me just find you in the list. So I might pick the wrong Lisa. All right, let's see if that works. Did you get the invite?
Yes, just a
Okay,
second.
great. Okay. And if something goes wrong, I've got to back up.
Okay. Are you seeing any of my screens?
Yes, we're seeing your desktop.
My desktop? Okay, hold on a second.
Okay,
Okay,
now we're seeing it in full screen.
awesome. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to jump right in on this presentation. It's going to be about the 2021 MUTCD update and why you should care. So the manual on uniform traffic control devices is for streets and highways, is one of the federal documents that regulates how and when traffic control signal signs, markings, and other treatments are designed. So I will attempt to take a very dry topic and make it very relevant to many of the things that we do. I'll start out with an overview and what this is, then provide some good news and not so good news, and tell you how to get involved. So, right now, FHWA, or the US DOT, is in the process of updating this manual or sections of the MUTCD for the first time in more than 10 years. Unfortunately, the currently proposed update continues to tinker around the margins without fundamentally fixing some of the inherent flaws. So NACTO and a coalition of cities are calling FHWA to commit to a comprehensive overhaul of the MUTCD, which was last rewritten in 1971. So the proposed updates to the MUTCD includes over 650 changes on 780 pages of marked up text. There are 523 figures and 68 tables. And while this may be seen as an insurmountable amount of material to cover, this is actually just a revision, not an overhaul of the actual Mutcd manual. So there are a lot of players involved in this process, starting obviously with US DOT and FHWA, the owners of the document, and then they're surrounded by a lot of experts and volunteers that are on the national committee that is instrumental in the actual rewrites. They have representation from various sponsoring organizations and technical committees on every topic that is covered in this manual. And yes, they are following a very process, a very rigid process, no less. But like most problem resolution processes, the problem is normally very clear and in focus up front. But if it takes, 11 years to bring an update for public comment, it's time to question the process and, more importantly, the validity of some of the recommendations. And I guess that's exactly what some of these organizations that are really pushing back hard are doing. So the difference between progress in the manual updates and not such good progress is literally hidden in the details. So these organizations, NACTO, Transportation for America, APDP, and America Walks are leading the plea for the reframing of the MUTCD as a more proactive safety regulation. The 15 cities also listed on this slide and accompanying 6 other organizations, including the Association of MPOs, have already written formal comments, and these comments range from very broad to very specific concerns. So I'm going to cover some of the general concerns first that are outlined by these organizations. For example, with close to 800 pages of marked up text in the update, who is doing the reality check to make sure that the manual is meeting its future intent? So these agencies are certainly questioning the outcome of hundreds of microscopic comments being presented without such an overview. The general concerns expressed for the need for completely reframing the document. They encourage inclusion and equity by establishing a racial equity task force, and they're concerned with outdated practices that prioritize motor vehicle efficiency over safety. There are also general concerns with less flexibility for cities, especially those that have committed to climate change and Vision Zero. And it doesn't allow for the rapid innovation in either design, quick fixes, technical urbanism that have been applied in so many communities across the country. So there is a concern also that the manual needs to align with equity, safety, sustainability goals of cities. So the concerns that the manual is outdated and it needs to prioritize the safety of vulnerable users and address context sensitivity is critical, which this Mutcd does not. And while some of the opening statements in the FHWA webinar slides are contrary to the statement, the devil is truly in the details of the text modifications. So there's a call for going back, to its original premise that this manual should, state how signs and signals look, but not how they should be used, because every community is different. So there's also new language that omits the needs of children, elderly, and disabled road users that may seem to, as they call it, not demonstrate due care. So this is victim blaming, and this is not appropriate in this manual. So the new language permits practitioners to actually ignore the needs of vulnerable users based on this new harsh language. Some of the new language also calls for the right-of-way of streets to be dedicated to highway-related uses only. And this undermines placemaking efforts to create people places, such things as landscaping, art, benches, etc., including prohibiting crosswalk art, instead of simply guiding it as in the current manual. There's also a new update that requires cities to adopt and prioritize emerging AV technology instead of waiting till such technology is proven to be roadworthy. So on one hand, the MUTCD requires AV technology be included, but on the other hand, no pedestrian push buttons at intersections are required. And I'll talk about that in a second. So this is an example, from NACTO. The rainbow crosswalks are now prohibited, not because there is proven safety studies stating that they are dangerous, which there are none whatsoever, but rather that the art may be distracting to drivers, and people walking may choose to linger in the street observing the art. So for a committee that is all about the research and data, this has become arbitrary. So I'm going to get into a couple of specifics to demonstrate exactly what some of these agencies are making their statements. So there are, and I must admit, there's a lot of technical topics and treatments and markings and signs and signals discussed in this update. I'm only going to cover 4 categories: speed limits, signals and warrants, bicycle treatments, and painted crosswalks. So I have taken the slides from the FHWA webinars to illustrate specific comments. So let's start with speed limits, for example. On the surface, it sounds good. It talks about greater flexibility for context. It clarifies the use of the 85th percentile speed method. And it says it considers the NTSB recommendations from their report in 2017. So let's dig in a little bit. Here's another slide from their presentation, and this is also good too. It talks about posted speed limits no longer must be within 5 miles per hour of the 85th running speed. And this is very important, where before this little statement alone kept a lot of professionals not even considering different methods to set speeds. So this is also good, heading in the right direction. However, the MUTCD has required elements, recommended elements, and optional elements. And with it, using the 85th percentile speed method is still recommended, while the NTSB 2017 report recommended it should be eliminated altogether. So expended factors to be required in engineering studies, context, land use, users, safety, and target speed are also only recommended, not required. So this leaves many practitioners to still very quickly opt out of using them. So why say an engineering study is required, but all the elements that are critical in it are recommended, optional? So in addition, related to speed limits, FHWA and the write-up, they're still ignoring the NTSB recommendation to remove 85th percentile speed. So we must request the full integration of the NTSB recommendations, and this is one of the big requests by the agencies following with the NACTO recommendations. Signal warrants, next topic, are some of, one of the rewritten sections in the MUTCD. And yes, they did change the language to be more lenient from required elements to just a recommendation. So this is positive change. But what is not said is how outdated signal warrant requirements truly are. In fact, none of them are changed. So these outdated warrants ignore known conflicts in land use. Pedestrian volumes needed, for example, to justify a traffic signal are actually higher than the motor vehicle volumes for the same safe crossing. So let's take a look at that. So I pulled up the tables, and here are the volume warrants that shows a traffic signal to be justified by vehicular traffic. About 80 cars on the minor side street. So all you need is 80 cars to justify it under these conditions. But if you're trying to justify a signal based on pedestrian volumes under the same conditions, you must have a minimum of not 100, not 105, 110, but exactly 107 pedestrians per hour crossing the major street. And I emphasize major street here because if there is no marked crossing at this location, what's the likelihood that anyone will be crossing, period? Again, outdated warrants that are not equitable nor in conformance with the system's approach to safety. Let's take a look at another critical warrant, this outdated crash warrant, where multiple years of crashes that must be correctable by a new signal. Again, this is in complete opposition to the safe systems approach and Vision Zero principles, which states we must be proactive and institute additional safety countermeasures and known locations to prevent crashes, not wait till people die before retrofitting. So here's one of the tables that I pulled up that states in order to meet the traffic signal warrant based on safety, you must kill a minimum of 4 people during a 3-year period before a signal can be warranted and installed. Another one, if you're on a road with 40 miles per hour or higher, which is most roads and arterials in Hillsborough County, or if you are in a small community with less than 10,000 population, you must kill a minimum of 9 people in 3 years before a signal can be warranted under the safety lens. So this makes the point that the efficiency of vehicles are much more important than the lives of people. So moving on to pedestrian signals. So this is good that new guidance on push button locations are provided now, such as at school crossings and anytime a signal is justified based on pedestrian needs. That's all wonderful. And I also like even the touch-free push buttons resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic are now an acceptable treatment at intersections. All good. What's not so good, did you notice that pedestrian signals are not required? They're only recommended. So with pedestrian deaths spiking by 30% plus across the nation, this document still does not require them, which is unfathomable. One of the National Committee members reports that this item continuously comes up for discussion and is shut down by AASHTO because it may place heavy cost burdens on communities to require them. Fatalities are a heavy cost burden communities, not push buttons. So let's move on to traffic signals. Flashing yellow arrow signals are now official and no longer interim approval. This is all good. We do see a lot of these flashing arrows in town, and they do have a lot of safety merit. RRFBs are also officially approved devices. This is also huge, as both the Florida House and the Senate bills call for modification of these devices. And we should be commenting on that too. Moving on to bicycle treatments and signals. This is a brand new section in the MUTCD, and that includes lots of guidance on green colored pavement at conflict points. This is also very good. I'm just going to skim through a couple of these real fast. Bike boxes are also recommended for interim approval, which still requires studies and justification, but it's now in there. We have more guidance on buffered and separated bicycle lanes and how to stripe them or mark them. But these are also just, a lot of them are all just recommendations, so you're still able to opt out. So for the not so good, interim approvals on some of these measures and recommended treatments have requirements for more studies, and the restrictions associated with some of these studies preclude or burden important design innovations that help improve safety of vulnerable and road users. There's also language in this new chapter that takes away tools such as the use of counterflow bike lanes next to parking. And there are other restrictions in some of the text that make hundreds of bike lanes now non-compliant. So communities actually need flexibility to consider all tools based on the context and potential constraints that may be present. So let's move on to crosswalks. FHWA claims that there are no warrants or thresholds. Decision is local, and new content on markings sounds good on the surface, right? However, crosswalks, there's certainly more information clearly stipulating the need for other treatments in addition to a crosswalk, especially on high-speed multi-lane roads. And this is all good. You know, they're talking about don't simply stripe a crosswalk. You should think about making sure it's high visibility. You should put RFBs or beacons or bump outs, whatever it is to make it safer. That's all good. However, what they are glossing over in the FHW presentation is the decision process that is now much more stringent related to new unsignalized or mid-block crossing applications. These state that at a mid-block crossing, for example, cannot be any closer than 600 feet to another intersection controlled by a traffic signal. And as such, new mid-block crossing must also be coordinated with an upstream signal. This means it must be a traffic signal or a hawk or a hybrid beacon. So the minimum spacing is also a concern between signalized intersections, which is detrimental to the urban walkability in cities. A lot of them are trying to build, which is smaller blocks. So pedestrians would rather cross traffic at a non-signalized location, such as a mid-block, than have to walk like a quarter mile out of the way to get to their destination. So forcing pedestrians to choose of crossing a mid-block where it's not potentially permitted or safe increases the opportunity for more crashes. So how is that safe? So the new guidance is dictating where and how a new crossing must look like. I know there are pedestrian thresholds to be met when justifying a traffic signal on a hawk and a hybrid beacon, so making more crossings more difficult is definitely not the right direction. And the revisions do not include any new aesthetic treatments, unlike what they mentioned. In fact, the multicolored treatments or the crosswalk art that is popping up all over the country are now considered under research by FHWA. So FHWA is actually ignoring the hundreds of multicolored treatments applied and tested throughout the nation. And this is a new best practice in most cities, including the city of Tampa with their Art on the Block program and the Crosswalks to Schools program. So we must request the acceptance of proven painted crosswalks and decorative painted intersections as part of these modifications. So the MPO staff has the information on how to submit comments. It doesn't take much to put a 2-page letter together, and I would urge everybody to write one, if not through the MPO, even on a personal level or with your connections with other agencies. The website has actual draft documents that you can take a look at. They have already been posted. Both NACTO and even America Walks have template letters to start with. But as I said right up front, there is so many communities that are already writing their specific comments that it's very easy to just review some of those letters and formulate your own. With that, in conclusion, evolving design and practice, G Vision Zero goes to eliminating traffic deaths is critical. So as communities continue to test and prove safe new treatments, the evolution of both federal, state, and local design guides and standards must evolve to effectively meet this goal. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Flores. Is there any comments or questions for Ms. Flores?
This is Cal Hardy. One of the other things that was in there was I don't think she covered it. Paula covered it as well, but it was that the any kind of testing that we do in order to look at the safety benefits of, let's say, any of the painting crosswalks or anything like that. Anything that we have to do is we can't just use crash statistics. It all has to be in a published report as well. So basically, any kind of research has to be published and peer reviewed as well. Which, you know, to be honest, that's a lot of work for to be put on to the city employees. Basically, we would end up having to hope for someone else to do that work as well. So just another thing that's in there that's a little bit kind of onerous to agencies.
Correct, Cal. Yes, it is. And that is mentioned, I think I mentioned it, I glossed over, pass over it. It is burdensome for all the local communities to become researchers now and publishing this documentations needed to justify some of these well-known treatments.
Yeah, and Paul, I was wondering, you know, I saw a lot of responses and people calling or writing to the FHWA during the comment period, but I was also wondering if it was something that, considering the emphasis that the secretary has put on to, like, Vision Zero, he mentions Vision Zero a lot and things like that, if it would be worthwhile to also contact the secretary's department directly.
Yes, and I think actually these larger agencies, NACTO especially, is working diligently with Secretary Buttigieg. You know, if all of you are paying attention to what's happening at the federal level, he seems to be extremely focused on driving new policy at every level related to creating safer streets that are climate responsible, sustainable, and all of that. So they have been interfacing with them. And if you go on social media, you'll see a lot of their tweets and everything else is also hashtagging Secretary Buttigieg. So he's aware of how cities are being impacted by some of these, what some may think are small changes that have no impacts, but have very serious impacts. Yeah, so it does not hurt to contact the new secretary directly, or send them your letters or send them your tweets as often as you can.
Okay, and then one more point just to bring up, Paula had mentioned the hawks and the hybrid beacons in the traffic signals as being mandatory because they would be coordinated with traffic signals. Just to let everybody know, the RRFBs are about $16,000 per crossing, or maybe it might be per assembly. I can't remember if it's per assembly or per crossing, but let's just say 15 to 30 grand for a crossing there. A hawk is basically like 150 because there's a lot bigger foundation and stuff like that goes into a hawk compared to an RRFB. So it just limits the amount of material that we can actually put out there for a safer crossing. So I just wanted to kind of bring that point up as well.
Great comment.
Thank you, Connie. Any other questions or comments?
Hey, this is Carlos Ramirez. Hey, Paul, great presentation. Many thank you, Jesus exclamations for me during your presentation. So once you a copy of this presentation, I'll go ahead and present it to the Greater Tampa ITE so we can draft a letter as well and send it in.
Great. Thank you. I can do that.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ms. Flores, for your report.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Before we move on, I just wanted to see if the committee's wish is to support MPO staff in drafting comments similar to what Ms. Flores presented and submitting them on behalf of the MPO. It seems like this would be something you guys would want us to take action on.
This is Karen Kress. I would be totally happy to make that motion. I kind of thought that was already in the works, so thank you for clarifying that.
Like to make sure I've got the will of the committee behind us.
This is Carlos. I'll second.
A motion has been made by Ms. Karen Kress, seconded by Carlos Ramirez. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you. Motion passes, Ms. Silva.
Okay. And I'll remind everybody that in your agenda packet, there are many links to helpful resources, but I may send out a reminder so that you can personally comment if you'd like to submit comments. Okay. All right. Now let me give Karen Kress.
Ms. Kress, are you there?
I'm here.
Would you like to talk about the Franklin Street vision?
I would love to do that as soon as I can figure out how to pull
Share
up the
your screen.
presentation. Let's see. Sorry, I'm not as familiar with the system.
All right. You got the invitation to be presenter, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yep.
Yes.
Now we're seeing it. Okay, great.
Oh, you see it? Okay. All right.
Now-
Good.
yeah.
Good. Well, thanks for having me. It's a little bit hard to follow Paula's amazing presentation, but I was invited to give you an overview of, can you still see the presentation?
We can see the presentation. You might want it to zoom out a little bit so that we can see the full page because we're seeing a partial page, or if you could maximize it a little bit.
Oh, gosh.
We're
Well, what I'm going to do, and it might not look as good as it could, but
see your plus minuses up there. If you would hit minus a couple of times, then we could see more of a full page. There you go. All right.
okay. Thank you.
All
So I haven't turned this into an actual presentation. What I would like to do is basically just scroll through this visioning document that is hot off the press, just to kind of introduce you to the plan that's been really fun to work on. It's been an interesting challenge in a way due to the fact that we pretty much did all of this during the pandemic, but I think we were able to pivot pretty well and use the online resources that were available. And really, having the plan done was kind of the easy part. The hard part is going to be the implementation of the plan. So I would say that Franklin Street would probably already classify as a livable roadway, but certainly some room for improvement. So I'll just, again, scroll through here and I'll try to be brief. But Stantec was our planning partner with this, and then we met with several key individual and group stakeholders, including, of course, the city of Tampa. But one of the cool things, maybe just enlarge this a little bit, one of the cool things about Franklin Street is that it really has served as our commercial main street really since the city's incorporation in the mid 1800s, and it is a street of firsts. So we did some interesting history on it and learned that Franklin was the first street to be paved in the city. It was the first street to be illuminated by electric street lights. It had the city's first sidewalk. The first brick building went on Franklin Street, which was the Bank of Tampa. And it was among one of the first to host the extensive streetcar network that I think was over 50 miles. We also have a lot of kind of our historic preservation that gives you downtown its unique character along Franklin Street. So here just are some of the kind of new and old photos. This map it shows the boundaries of the Tampa Downtown Partnership where we offer our special services district. So again, a little bit more about the history on Franklin Street. Was, you know, there's a ton of fabulous photos out there. Some demographics about our downtown. I can tell you that the study area that we looked at was 18 city blocks. It basically went from Jackson, where Poe Plaza ends, all the way up to Palm Avenue in Tampa Heights. It's just over a mile in length. It has been home to civic buildings, commercial storefronts, cultural facilities. For instance, probably some of these you've heard of, the Moss Brothers building, which is now a surface parking lot, the Woolworths, the SK Crest and Company, which of course is my favorite. It had 3 theaters. You know, thankfully, some active citizens were able to save the Tampa Theater. But there was also a Florida theater, and the Rialto Theater is still up in Tampa Heights and has been beautifully restored. But like many cities, you know, suburban competition, the removal of the streetcar, interstate expansion, you know, all of those things impacted downtown and specifically Franklin Street. So we were able to do a fair amount of community engagement. We did do walking tours of the area with just very small groups of interested stakeholders, and we noticed that it lent itself really to breaking into 4 different areas, kind of character districts. So the first one went from Jackson to Tyler, basically where Herman Massey Park is, and then that's more of kind of like the businessy side of it. And then you have Tyler to Scott, which is more of kind of the low-rise residential area. Then area 3, we just call the big swath of land underneath I-275, which is kind of a whole different subject, but certainly relevant. And then the 4th area was the Yellow Brick Row or Tampa Heights section from K to Palm. So some of the community engagement we were able to do, here's a map of those areas. Some of the community engagement we were able to do, we did surveys. We worked really hard to try to get answers from not only residents, but workers, from visitors, from, you know, business and property owners, and we were able to get a pretty good swath of different opinions. Let me keep going here. This is just talking about some of the distinct areas and kind of the good and the bad. Here's that interstate area I was talking about. Here's up in Tampa Heights. Here's the results of our surveys. We did one in the early summer, just trying to gauge opinion and, you know, what kind of priorities should we be setting. These are the results of those surveys. I know I'm spinning through this very quickly. I'm not expecting you to really read any of it, but you can certainly go back onto our website to see that. And then lots of open-ended comments, which are often, you know, some of the most interesting to read. And then we did a second survey in November, and, you know, basically said, okay, here's what we think we heard from you. Now help us prioritize where we should be spending our time and treasure. So that was also interesting. And then we, of course, we did over, you know, virtual, of course, we did the individual stakeholder and group stakeholder meetings as well. So these are some of those survey comments, results. We also had an interactive map, which I think was really helpful, that anyone could go on and make a comment. You could like or dislike other people's comments. It could be general, it could be very specific, like landscaping needs to be improved in this area or what have you. So, so that was also a very helpful tool. These are just, again, some of those results. So as you can see, we have our work cut out for us. Here's some of the information about the stakeholder interviews. Again, hopefully I'm not making you too dizzy by scrolling through this so quickly. So what the end result is, we have both general and block by block recommendations. I have been carefully trying to manage expectations, because although the partnership can have some influence through advocacy, we certainly don't have the funding to fix all of this. So one of the other helpful things is with the recommendations, we also have kind of the which group or organization or company would need to take the lead on it. So I'm turning that basically into a spreadsheet to start to track all of that now. You know, some things that the partnership can do, that's probably more of kind of the low-hanging fruit, things that we can afford. Some things we'll work with the city or the CRA on. You know, sometimes maybe the neighborhood group could do things like, you know, programming, that sort of thing. We've already identified another funding opportunity to kind of carry this on forward, and that is Hillsborough County has their historic preservation grant. It's a matching grant, but you can apply for up to $250,000. And you know, the historic preservation of this corridor really, I think, is what makes it unique. So this plan didn't dive very deep into that. So we're going to be applying for a county grant to really allow us to dive deeper and kind of take advantage of the historic character of the street. You know, we've already worked closely with the city. We have 2 intersection murals kind of on the north and the south end. We already had one business owner work with us and have lighting strung overhead on one block. We're working on getting that expanded down the corridor. We currently have an installation, kind of a 90-day pop-up in Likes Gaslight Park called The Square, partnering with Metropolitan Ministries to sell some food out there, and just really it's an opportunity for us to get some public input on how people would like to use Likes Gaslight Park, because we do want to put it in our budget to do kind of a whole redo of the park. So it's an interesting way to get some feedback. We have planters all over downtown, so we just did an inventory of those, and we're going to be relocating some of them along the Franklin Street corridor to provide some consistency there. Kind of the next steps with this now is to really get this out to all the stakeholders that we've worked with and start rolling up our sleeves and just working through all the recommendations. So, so that's just a very quick overview of the plan. Again, happy to review it with anyone individually or with a group if you'd like. And you can access this information on our website. So that's it for me, unless there's questions or comments.
Thank you, Ms. Kress. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Ms. Kress?
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Kress. Ms. Silva, any action need to be taken on this?
Nope, it was for information. Great project. Thank you so much for sharing it with us, Karen. We've been waiting patiently for it to get all wrapped up. So a great livable roadway with a bigger, shinier future.
Do we have Josh Barber on the line? There you are, Josh. Joshua, thank you.
Yes, sir. And I also have Dana Lazarus with me, who will be co-presenting as well. I'm curious, what screen do you all see right now?
We're seeing the layout one instead of the full screen one.
Okay. It only shares the screen, so I'm just going to present from this, if that's all right.
Okay, if you could minimize your toolbar, that would help us.
Yeah, definitely. Hold on. Apologies. GoToWebinar is a little clunky.
Yep.
Okay, how does that work?
Oh, lovely. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. All right. Good morning, everyone. Josh Barber, Hillsborough MPO staff. I'm here to provide an update on our 2021 Title VI and non-discrimination plan. I want to provide a little bit of a project background. Our last Title VI and non-discrimination plan was adopted by the MPO board back in March of 2018. And this is a federally required document and process that demonstrates our compliance with federal civil rights legislation, such as Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, the Executive Order on Environmental Justice, and others. And best practice is considered to update this document every 3 years with new demographic information and other efforts. So that puts us our update for this year, of course. The plan covers our process for identifying our underserved communities and locating them spatially. We review how we engage those communities in our work, how we evaluate the equity outcomes of our plans, whether that's through the regional planning model or GIS analysis on a plan-by-plan basis. We also look at how we integrated the principles of Title VI and non-discrimination and equity in our primary program areas. So the LRTP, the TIP, the work program, etc. And also one of the major components is the MPO must have a Title VI complaint process, a form, procedures for carrying that forward, as well as a staff person responsible for overseeing that. And so the big thing this year, as part of the MPO's resolution on racial equity and our executive leadership's commitment to advancing equity broadly, the plan will be expanded to include the City County Planning Commission. And so I want to go a little bit, give a little bit of background on what groups are covered under federal law, where we must ensure non-discrimination in the provision of our agency activities. Race, ethnicity, color, and national origin comes directly out of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Income comes out of the Executive Order on Environmental Justice. You see non-discrimination based on disability coming out of the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, as well as the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. And there's subsequent federal legislation and executive orders that cover the rest of these as well. And so a little bit about our scope of work. One of the big things we wanted to do first off was define equity for the agency. We really felt this was an essential first step to ensure that what we were doing aligned with an overall guiding principle or set of principles. And the next major component was looking at the history of racism and discrimination and planning policy in Hillsborough County. This aligned directly with one of our major principles of equity, which was the idea of recognition of both historical discrimination as well as those contemporary legacies. We also identified our communities of concern or our underserved communities, which we'll talk about a bit later. We did a review of existing equity work for both the MPO and the Planning Commission. So how was equity and non-discrimination incorporated into stuff like the comprehensive plan for the city and the county, the cities and the county? We conducted an extensive community engagement process for this plan update. This is not something we did for the 2018 plan. So really looking towards community leadership to inform the recommendations that we make in the next task. And so I'll talk a little bit about how planning kind of got us here. You know, this is a major component, like I said, of our equity work. And on a fundamental level, from local governments to the federal government, our country has really failed to address the legacy of racism. And while many of us know the general history of stuff like urban renewal, of local, state, national law and politics throughout the early 20th century, and we may know generally how these policies manifested themselves in Hillsborough County, we have to take steps as a government and government agency to document and acknowledge the very specific and intentional ways that our policies have altered and shaped our community, specifically how those policies have impacted Black people and other people of color, and create a process for discussing those policies, relating them to current community challenges, and a vision for how to overcome those challenges. And so a little bit of a disclaimer and a content warning. Some of these slides have quotes and images from historical documents that are bigoted, inappropriate, and insensitive by today's standards. They are provided for clarity and to ensure that there is no mincing of words, that you know, they're provided so that we all know exactly what they said. So a little bit about public and private housing. This is one area we looked at, including deed restrictions in Hillsborough County. These are clauses in property deeds that state basically that these properties shall never be sold, rented, leased to Black people or other racial and ethnic minorities. We took some time to go to the clerk of the court's office and look at property deeds prior to 1964 and found several racially restrictive covenants and property in Hillsborough County, including Ruskin, Seminole Heights, North Hyde Park, Davis Islands. We also did a review of public housing, both on the national level and then how public housing was implemented in Hillsborough County. The big thing here is, of course, that public housing was used in the county as well as nationwide to create and reinforce racial and ethnic segregation, as well as class-based segregation, both through the displacement of Black residents in certain areas and the concentration of Black residents in other areas. So, for example, the Tampa Bay Times, in their history of the Zion Cemetery, which I think most of us are familiar with, that they stated that reports from the time of the construction of Robles Park Village stated that many Black people were displaced as a result of the housing complex, which was a whites-only housing complex when it was built. And we'll see this get manifested in comprehensive plans later. And then the other major area we looked at was, of course, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This was a program that came out of the Roosevelt administration's New Deal in the 1930s and created a uniform appraisal system for mortgage lending across the nation. And they created these what are called residential security maps that evaluated neighborhoods based on stuff like the age of housing stock and the condition of housing stock to rate their risk for mortgage lending. And most of the neighborhoods that were redlined or yellow line deemed undesirable often contained racial and ethnic minorities and really reflected the racial prejudices and class prejudices endemic to America at the time. So I want to dive a bit into comprehensive planning and zoning. Staff took a pretty comprehensive look at the earliest zoning laws in the county as well as the comprehensive plans, both at the national level, kind of seeing how this enacted and then coming back down once again to the local level. And so the first real major plan adopted by a jurisdiction in the county was the City of Tampa's Major Street Plan in 1941. It looks at stuff like existing conditions, the history of the area, the growth and development of the city, its demographic makeup. And it was really the earliest siting of what would become the interstate highway system in Tampa. And it points to the quote at the bottom, makes a clear policy directive that, the routing of the interstate highway could do a significant work towards clearing up the blighted slum north of Cass Street on both sides of Central Avenue, which was the scrub at the time. And then you also see explicit policy directives relating to the map on the right, which shows predominantly Black neighborhoods in Tampa. And they state that these several areas act as directives in considering the growth and development of the city. And you'll see how what specific directives are carried out in future plans. The zoning plan in 1942 built upon the Major Street Plan. The zoning plan, there was not any explicit racial, ethnic, or class-based justification cited for the zoning map in the plan to the right, but nonetheless, the plan cannot really be divorced from the era in which it was crafted and the political context of Tampa at the time. If we look at the areas zoned as multifamily in this map, areas such as West Tampa over here and East Tampa over here, you can clearly see that they relate very closely to predominantly Black neighborhoods, East Tampa and West Tampa here. And that really speaks to the process of exclusionary zoning, whereby, large areas of the city were zoned single family with large lots, and that effectively excluded Black and low income residents from living in that area. And then also you see other explicit policy directives towards slum clearance and racial and class-based segregation. You can see that on slums, they stated that areas occupied by Black people should be eliminated and moved to other areas. And then you see this quote regarding the construction of North Boulevard homes and how other small areas occupied by Black people should be eliminated and those residents transferred to other areas. And you see that carried out throughout the rest of Tampa's history, whether urban renewal or highway construction, so on. And the 1945 Comprehensive Plan, this looks at stuff like parks and recreation, civic art, civic centers, utilities as well. They talk about recommendations for more public, for segregated public facilities in West Tampa and 22nd Street and MLK. They describe the scrub as an economic barrier to the most healthful, wholesome development of the city, as a cancerous infection ripe for major operation. And you can see on the map to the left, a proposed civic center on the site that was the scrub. And then, I want to point out that this is not endemic to only the city of Tampa. The Hillsborough County's growth was primarily focused on the city throughout the early 20th century, but you see these policies being carried out as well in Plant City and the county as a whole. This plan, adopted in 1956, was written by George Simons. And one of the first maps in the document shows so-called predominant non-white areas, which is shown in the top left here, primarily south of the Seaboard Railroad tracks on the south side of town. And then on the topic of Parks and Rec, the city acknowledges that no public facilities had been built for Black people in the city at the time. And on the map on the right, you can see the location of public schools in Plant City, which were segregated by race as well. Over here, you can see existing white schools, and on the bottom, existing non-white schools. In addition, the plan talks about the creation of a housing authority, which received funding from the Public Housing Administration at the federal level. They talked about having 3 public housing projects, 2 for Black people, 1 for white people, and that the 2 projects for Black people were both located on the south side of town. And they stated that the projects will eliminate much of the slum and substandard conditions now prevailing south of the tracks. So I want to go a little bit now into urban renewal, which we took a pretty deep dive into. Urban renewal projects were funded under the 1949 Federal Housing Act with the intent of slum clearance. These were basically the federal government provided loans to local jurisdictions to purchase, condemn, whether through eminent domain or other means, what were deemed blighted areas. And then the cities would make some public improvements and then sell off the land to developers to pay off the loan. And the federal government really had an expectation that there would be publicly subsidized housing to mitigate the displacement of residents as a result of these projects. In Hillsborough County, we had 4, the Scrub, or Maryland Avenue, as it's called in federal legislation or federal records, the Riverfront area, or Roberts City, Ybor City, and of course there was one in Plant City as well. And so just to go a little bit into the Scrub, or Maryland Avenue, this project was funded in 1962 and was identified for over a decade as an area for redevelopment for the city. We kind of went over how the city's comprehensive plan described the area in the 1942 and 1941 plans. And there are subsequent plans that continued to cite this area as an eyesore, as a blight on the community's health and morals. The site was 60 acres with 376 families, and by the time demolition started for this project, there was no housing developer selected to replace the demolished units. As a result, by 1963, only 21 of the 106 families that were looking for relocation had been housed, and 8 of them were relocated to substandard housing. It wasn't until 1966, nearly 4 years after the project started, that a builder was designated to construct low-income housing at the site. That land was donated to the developer, and those would become Tampa Park Apartments. The Tampa branch of the NAACP as well raised significant concerns about this project throughout its life. The agency criticized the city's desire to reestablish the neighborhood as Black only, which flew in the face of decisions such as Brown versus Board of Education, which was pushing for the end of segregation in public facilities at the time. And the NAACP also significantly criticized the lack of community representation on the Citizens Advisory Committee for the Urban Renewal Agency, which was white only. And these complaints were eventually raised to the federal level. The quote below is from Robert Saunders in a letter he wrote to another member of the NAACP. And you can see that he states that if the project continues as it was currently going, that Black people in Tampa will be relegated to a continuous pattern of racially segregated housing for the next 50 to 100 years. And then the Riverfront project was funded in 1963. The maps on the right show the location where to the left is facing north. A 1961 survey showed in the study area 10 white families, 670 Black families, 97 of which were owner-occupied homes, 176 businesses, and 6 institutions. As part of the redevelopment, the University of Tampa purchased about 25 acres along the river, which was ultimately sold to another private party without any development occurring. And the city of Tampa also purchased several acres for the construction of a municipal library, which would become John F. Germany, as well as 5 acres for the construction of a cultural center. Other land was sold off to private entities for offices, hotels, and other commercial uses. And then more land was also used for the construction of the interstate highway system, which is labeled as I-4 in these maps, as it once was. While the city made assurances to the federal government that subsidized housing would be built on the site to accommodate those who were displaced, it took a long time for that to happen. It wasn't until the early 1970s that projects such as Presbyterian Village and Oakhurst Square were built. And then highway construction. Highway construction was funded under the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act. And Tampa was uniquely situated at the intersection of 2 designated highways, I-4 and what would become I-275, or what was I-75 at the time. In addition to these 2 interstates, we had the construction of the Crosstown Expressway in the 1970s. And the big takeaway here is that the construction of these interstates, both the Crosstown and I-4 and I-275, would result in significant displacement of largely Black and Latin residents in West Tampa, the Scrub, Ybor City, Dobyville, and the Garrison. And as you saw in the 1942 zoning plan for the city, there was a very specific intent to use the construction of a highway in the city to clear the neighborhoods identified as substandard, or essentially where they did not want Black people to live. And so this shows some aerials that were part of the Master Highway Transportation Plan in 1957. You can get a very clear idea of Tampa's urban form at the time and what was really lost to the construction of the interstate highway. This is the extent of this image is from Armenia Avenue to North Boulevard. This image is, of course, the downtown interchange. You can see the area of the Scrub here, along with Central Park Village, and of course, Franklin Avenue traveling up here. And then this is from Nebraska Avenue to the left and 22nd Street to the right, right through Ybor City. And you have 15th Avenue right here in the middle. And so where are we at the end of the late 1960s? I think Richard Rothstein in The Color of Law really put it succinctly that basically the federal government, through major legislation and programs throughout the 20th century, sought to persuade as many white families as possible to move from urban apartments to single family homes. And then following the processes of suburbanization, the federal government, with assistance by local authorities, with explicit racial intent, made it nearly impossible for Black people to follow. And so we see the destruction of several major Black and Latin neighborhoods in the city, including Dobyville, the Scrub, Roberts City on the riverfront, Ybor City, and the Garrison. We see explicit policies related to the destruction of these neighborhoods for the purposes of economic development and highway construction. We see further segregated neighborhoods throughout the city and the county, both in East Tampa and North Boulevard and West Tampa, as well as Progress Village, which was constructed to mitigate displacement from highway construction. We see the explicit exclusion of Black people from the housing market and from wealth generation in the form of racial covenants and other restrictions such as exclusionary zoning policies, which continue to this day. And then the exclusion of Black individuals from political office, whether that was from the white municipal party, which ruled Tampa's politics throughout the early 20th century, as well as from planning efforts and self-determination of how their communities should grow. And with that, I'm going to hand this off to Dana to transition us into our modern day and talk about our mapping as well as our community engagement. And Dana, just let me know when you want me to move forward.
Okay, thank you. Wow. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to start. So this transition is now from where we've been to where we are. So one way that we're getting a snapshot of inequity today is through our mapping process, which is also required for our non-discrimination plan. Next slide, please. So this first map shows the threshold method. The best way to understand what's going on here is we took all the block groups of Hillsborough County and we ordered them from highest to lowest by the percentage of a given demographic. On the left is racial minorities and on the right is low-income households. And then we cut them into fifths. So the darkest areas that you see on these maps are the top fifth, and the next darkest are the next fifth in terms of the number of people in that demographic. Next slide. And then to help us further understand our community characteristics, we overlaid certain portions of those maps. So the map on the left shows the intersection of our minority population. That includes race and ethnicity, as well as our low income population. So you see those dark purple areas represent the intersection of those. On the right, same thing, but with people with disabilities and low income households. Next slide, please. And our final mapping methodology, which is an additional mapping methodology that we added to this non-discrimination plan update, is called dot density. So where the threshold method is sensitive to considerations of these particular groups in like more rural areas of the county by absolute percentage, these dot density maps reflect the absolute distribution of people across the county, so you can get an idea of density. On the map is race and ethnicity, where green is Black folks, blue is white folks, red is Asian, and orange is Hispanic folks. On the right map is our low income households. So we did do a lot more maps than this. We mapped 0 vehicle households, female head of households, and limited English proficient households, for example, as required by federal legislation. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about what we did for community engagement for this plan to get a further understanding of the needs and challenges and what people are going through today, as well as to get some ideas to guide our recommendations and guide some solutions towards more equitable outcomes in our community. So I'm going to really dive into 4 of our outreach strategies. We did a survey, field outreach, a storytelling forum, and focus groups. Next slide. So the reason that we added this engagement component is because community leadership is a key component of equity. it is a key component of our operational definition of equity that Plan Hillsborough is using. So we went into this with two purposes. One, to use the feedback from the community to generate recommendations that will be in the non-discrimination plan. Again, like policy recommendations, process and planning recommendations to improve equitable outcomes, and also to build relationships between local government and the people to be able to make sure that this work is sustainable, and so that we can continue building partnerships in the community and not do like a one and done kind of outreach strategy. So with our outreach, we did focus on underserved communities and the needs of underserved communities. So those communities that, those demographics that Josh mentioned early on, so people of color, low income persons, people with disabilities, people discriminated against by sex and gender, just for example, are people that we really wanted to reach with our efforts. Next slide. So our engagement was, the way that we designed our engagement was, is through 3 phases. We had an early engagement phase, an active engagement phase, and we will be having an ongoing engagement phase. In the early engagement phase, we really wanted to make sure that we understood the lay of the land, that we built up our contact lists for people interested in equity and who are members of underserved communities. We created a web page and a brand. So the Planning for Equity initiative has our little logo, which you can see down there on the left. The active engagement phase is what I'm going to talk more about in the following slides, but this was the phase when we actually went out and asked people what they're dealing with and their solutions, ideas. And the ongoing engagement phase is also really important. It is, again, to make sure that this isn't a one and done effort and that people don't feel tokenized when we are asking them for their incredibly valuable stories and ideas and their very personal experiences. So we want to make sure that we have a built-in process to bring the plan back to them and make sure that they can see where their feedback was utilized, and that they stay in the loop and can continue leading. Next slide. So the first outreach strategy that we launched last December that I'm going to talk about is our Planning for Equity survey. And so each one of these 4 outreach strategies has its own purpose, and we wanted to get different information from different audiences. So the survey, we wanted to get a broad response. So this was for everybody in the county. This was about quantity, and we wanted to collect data that we could analyze. It's quantitative data. So lots of like a matrix of access. So the questions that we focused on for the survey were about discrimination and access. So we asked about access to different community elements, access to transportation, healthcare, educational opportunities. We really focused on the quality of these community elements as well. So it wasn't just, do you have access to housing, but do you have access to quality housing? And then they rated that on a scale of it's very difficult to it's very easy. We also asked about people's perceptions on discrimination and if discrimination and systemic discrimination has impacted their access. And we asked for a few solutions. So we got a lot of input on these really key ideas. We actually collected about 500 surveys. We pushed it out on social media. We had them on flyers. We emailed them directly to our contacts. And we also did a field outreach campaign with the survey. Next slide. So the survey was the tool that we used for this next strategy. So again, these strategies kind of built off each other. We verbally administered the survey in underserved communities. So by doing this, we ensured representation of underserved people so that, again, the purpose was to understand the needs and challenges of underserved people and to hear directly from them about their solution ideas. So using one of the maps that we created to understand the location of where different demographics are, I used the intersection of race and income. We identified key locations across the county, and then using with a team of 3, it was myself, Fatima, who speaks fluent Spanish, and a member of the community, Marco. We, the 3 of us, went out 7 days a week, for 7 weeks, 3 days a week, 5 hours a day, and we verbally talked to people, and we talked through the survey with them so that we could ensure that they understood the questions, and again, to ensure that we were getting feedback from people in those communities. So we went to hotspots like Fresco y Mas, bodegas. We went into these neighborhoods as well. And our goal was to collect a total of 50 surveys. And through this field outreach process, we collected about 250 surveys. So we really did well with this, I think. Next slide. And it was really important that this was part of our strategy because we have to meet people where they're at. This is a grassroots outreach method, and it works. And there's a lot of data behind the fact that face-to-face is the best way to engage with people and to build trust and form new relationships. As you can see with the charts on the right, we were able to oversample members of underserved communities. It's also important to go meet people where they're at because a lot of times regular people working 3 jobs don't go to interest group meetings. We have relied often on leveraging our relationships with interest groups, HOAs, civic associations, things like that, and that's great. And we get a lot of great information that way, but sometimes we don't reach the most underserved people that way. And especially during COVID-19, a lot of these interest group meetings just weren't happening. So, or they moved online, and then again, a lot of underserved people don't have access to the internet sometimes. Next slide. And yes, we did do this during a pandemic. Timing waits for nobody, we had to go out there, and we were as safe as we had a safety plan. We were double masked, we wore the gloves, we had the hand sanitizer, we socially distanced from people when we were asking for their responses to the survey questions. The only time we exchanged, things that we touched, we had a paper survey, a paper flyer, and hand sanitizer that we gave people. Especially people getting on the bus were really grateful for the hand sanitizer, so that was neat. So just wanted to put the slide in there because a lot of people have questions about this, and I'm more than happy to talk more about how we did that. Next slide. All right, so the third strategy was a storytelling forum. So the audience, everybody, this was open to everybody in the county. So anybody who wanted to give input on these questions that we asked about access to different community elements and discrimination. And it was conducted virtually. We had 3 really amazing community partners, the Corporation to Develop Communities of Tampa, Metro Inclusive Health, and the Waimama CDC. And with this strategy, we wanted to get more stories. So we wanted to dig deeper into the trends that were emerging in the survey. So why are people saying that access to transportation is so difficult? Yeah, so that was it was like 2 hours on a Saturday, and we got some really fantastic feedback on that day from community leaders and anybody who wanted to come. Next slide. And then finally, the focus groups. So the focus groups, we identified people who said that they were interested in being in a focus group, who we reached out to during field outreach, mostly. So a lot of these people were people we had brand new relationships with. most of them. And again, were recruited from those underserved communities. These focus groups were demographic based. So because we wanted to understand the access needs and discrimination issues of these major demographics that are underserved. So Black and Latinx or Hispanic people make up the greatest demographic of race and ethnicity, or underserved race and ethnicity in Hillsborough County. We included people with disabilities and low income population and LGBTQ people. And we asked a series of questions, again, to dig deeper into some of the trends that were emerging from the survey. Similar questions to the storytelling forum. Next slide. And so right now I'm doing data analysis on dozens of pages of raw data, written stories, and long answers from the survey, and identifying themes and some unique ideas. And these are going to help guide the recommendations that we propose in the non-discrimination plan. The recommendations we're looking at all different recommendations, from agency-wide recommendations in hiring and public engagement and representation, to more specific policies for each of the agencies within Plan Hillsborough, MPO, and Planning Commission. So for example, for the MPO, maybe proposing that we use environmental justice areas to prioritize TIP projects, so budgeting solutions, and distribution of funds. And for Planning Commission, identifying affordable housing policies that will work. And there's a lot of recommendations that we're looking into, and it's really exciting. And I'm more than happy to talk more about that as well. Performance measures, we're going to propose performance measures to track how, equitable outcomes are changing, sidewalk gaps in underserved communities, the number of crashes that there's 20% more likely to be in a severe crash in a community of concern in Hillsborough County. So things like that will also be recommended. And I guess next slide. That concludes our presentation. Thanks, everybody.
Mr. Citro, you're muted. I can't hear you. Okay, there you are. Now we can.
It's going to be the #1 phrase coming out of this pandemic is you're muted. Ms. Lazares and Mr. Barber, thank you very much for this eye-opening and informative presentation. Fantastic. Is there any members here that have any questions or comments to Mr. Barber or Ms. Lazares?
Hey guys, this is Carlos Ramirez. Oh, sorry, Michael, did you want to go?
No, you go first. I'll wait.
Great presentation. That beginning, I've heard that before, but it's always very impactful to hear of all the things that have happened in the past. So it's definitely good to know so we can look at that and gain knowledge from that in the future. I was lucky enough to be a part of one of the equity focus groups, and it was great to hear other community members who are very passionate about equity and making things very good. Something that I had not expected to hear, but I heard a lot of is some of these folks are kind of shy about, coming up and talking about what their issues are in the community. But these guys that came on board, they were willing to tell it all. And, we came up with having like a spokesperson in the community that they can train, and they can be kind of like the person that goes out and raises the flag and yells. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting, there was a gentleman in the group who was an entrepreneur, but he was restricted by the land use in his area and was not able to changes community to that work, play, live, and places that we all are striving for. So those were some things that I learned being in these focus groups. But great effort, awesome outreach. Thank you so much for doing all this.
This is Arizona. How you doing?
Hey, Arizona, it's nice to see you.
The thing is, I enjoyed being a part of that broken group. That broken group was disabled. I was very proud of how you asked a lot of the questions that people did not know about the assets, the sidewalks, the job, the discriminations. I found that a lot of people that was on that broken group wasn't really understanding what they needed to do, but they got their voices heard. They just wanted to hear. They just wanted to hear. They have somebody listen to their voice, their concerns on different issues. And my last comment is, where is my Walmart card?
It's a Dana question.
Yeah, I've sent out several emails. I will get with you, Arizona, about that.
Thank you, Arizona. It was great to have you in the focus groups as well. Thank you for attending them.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you. Dana and Joshua, thank you for this. I was reading through it last week or when Lisa sent out the agenda, and honestly, it's kind of spooky sometimes when you read some of the quotes, and some of that stuff isn't that long ago when you think about it. But so thanks for including that. The question I had was, I think on one of the slides you mentioned, where at the very beginning you talk about age being a factor, but and maybe I missed it or later on, but the reason why I thought of it was specifically with children and with especially younger children who may have to walk to school or bike to school. And actually it came up because I think on one of the slides at the beginning, they talk about in kind of a weird way or messed up way they thought of it back in the day, of access to recreation, access to parks, and access to schools. And in terms of discrimination, and maybe this is more of a comment instead of a question, but I feel like a lot of times we don't think enough about a user under the age of 18 or a user who's maybe under the age of 12, and someone who may not have a ride to go somewhere, and how much that impacts how a road is designed, for example. And I'll bring up the example that is, I think, happening near where I live, which is actually an area that was redlined back in the day, but on Southdale Mabry, south of Gandy Boulevard, they are doing an access management project where you're closing the medians. They have added one mid-block crossing, which frankly is at an intersection I thought deserved a stoplight. But every day you have pedestrians who are crossing that portion of the street. You have people, you have kids, students riding their bicycles back and forth between Shearmont Elementary and Robinson High School. And the comment I made on another committee call with the Tampa Equity Group was, if those medians were even shrunk 18 inches on each side, you could have put in bike lanes. So you would have had full sidewalks on each side of the street and bike lanes on each side of the street. And that's ARIA transit corridor. So it wouldn't have taken much to make it a complete street or something close to that. And what gets me about that project, and what sometimes gets me about some of the other projects, is that we don't think enough about like a little kid and how they're going to experience it, because it's hard. You can tell an adult, you got to walk 3 blocks and cross the mid block. It's hard to tell an 8-year-old that. And not all of the kids now have the education we might have had as a kid, where they told you, look both ways and look once more to the left before you cross the street. So obviously education is a big part of it, but I just want to make that comment because similar to recycling, if you teach the kids how to do it, the adults will figure it out. I just think that's something that we need to think about more. I know Emily Hinsdale's on the committee, so she knows a lot more about this than I do. But the more I think we think about, say, that under 12-year-old crowd, maybe the streets can get safer if we're thinking about that type of user as well.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Marino. And we did do maps of youth population across the county as well. And I definitely agree it should be one of those groups that we especially consider during our planning process. And it reminds me of a comment that the MPO board received a few months ago about the incidence of crashes around racialized and ethnic schools, and how especially primarily Hispanic schools have a big crash problem. And so I definitely see the connections, and I think it's something we could definitely continue to work on as a county and in collaboration with the school board and other agencies.
And in community outreach, the Hillsborough County Schools sent out our survey, and we had a lot of parents responding. And one of the themes that is emerging in my data analysis is definitely the safe routes to school and what would make the routes safer. So that is a consideration in our analysis.
It really reminds me of Charles Brown's Arrested Mobility in his commentary on the policing of Black and brown people, especially youth. And there was a recent video that came out of some cops arresting some Black youth for riding through their town on a bicycle that wasn't registered. And it brings up this what's the pretext for stops, and how is policing conducted, especially with youth in neighborhoods that are not generally accessible or don't have good safety infrastructure as well. So there's a lot to unpack, definitely.
Are there any other questions or comments?
We had a comment in the chat that I'd like to read. So this was from Justin Willits. He said he had to jump off, but he would like to submit that the work done by the MPO is very informative for the community. I think that any current urban highway expansion plans that benefited from these historic transgressions, i.e. 275, 4, and Selman, should be questioned thoroughly and not be given a pass just because they're already constructed. Furthermore, anytime we add lanes to highways, we further diminish the value of transit and its ability to compete with single occupancy automobile travel. And then Sarah said, good points, Justin. So that's what's in the chat.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Mr. Barber, Ms. Lazaro, thank you very, very much. Michael, you made some very good points. Thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you, Councilman.
Thank you.
Tia, I sent an invite to become presenter. If you'd
Yes.
rather, okay, great.
I got it. I'm not sure which screen.
We're seeing the,
My random.
yeah.
No,
Okay, now we're seeing your
better.
presentation.
And I will swap screens.
Yep, and full screen now, so you're in good shape.
And I will turn my camera on. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to talk to you about the Transportation Equity Toolkit. It is a project that we are now wrapping up. Some of you may have been familiar with the Transportation Equity Scorecard, which is housed in this toolkit, and I'll touch on a bit during this presentation as well. I am going to jump right in if I can get my slides to move. All right, there we go. So the Toolkit is a resource for transportation planning agencies and communities as they work to advance equity. It provides a framework for the transportation equity needs assessment and an equity-based project prioritization process. The toolkit includes a number of resources and tools, but to fill the specific gaps we found in current practice, we developed the Transportation Equity Audit Tool and the Transportation Equity Scorecard. And we do highlight and emphasize throughout each of these processes that community engagement is necessary. So first, I will talk to you about the first half of the toolkit, which focuses on the transportation equity needs assessment, which is a framework to identify the specific transportation needs of traditionally underserved communities. The first step in this process that we identify would be to collect socioeconomic and demographic information to identify who those underserved communities are and where they are located. And I do want to note that during the mapping process, we use the term communities of concern, and we use it interchangeably with traditionally underserved communities or underserved communities. We would then calculate the concentration of communities of concern. Some of these methods were touched in the previous conversation on the threshold-based method or the dot density method. We in the toolkit recommend the threshold-based method, which uses the regional average for selected socioeconomic variables as a threshold for the concentrations. We would then identify and visually represent areas with a larger concentration of one or more groups of communities of concern. And as you can see on the map on the screen, the darker purple represents the high concentrations of communities of concern, and the lighter purple represents the lower concentrations. This is a map of the university area in Tampa. You can see the borders in red. We do encourage staff to engage the community in refining these boundaries as needed. Once the areas identified and the communities are identified, we can inventory and assess mobility needs to identify transportation assets and existing conditions. To do this, we summarize travel patterns and modes used, identify current and proposed projects and services, use GIS to build inventory maps. You can see the map on the screen where we have, once again, in the university area, you can see we identify bus routes, bus stops, where sidewalks are located, where bike lanes are located, and then all of those dots represent collisions involving bicyclists or pedestrians. The circles are pedestrians, the diamonds are bicyclists, and the red represents fatalities. These maps are then overlaid onto the communities of concern maps to determine where the assets are and the collision hotspots are located in relation to these communities. Once you identify where these hotspots are, it is good to do some groundwork and do some targeted field studies and summarize findings based on these studies. For our analysis for the toolkit, we identified where those large clusters were, and unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we were not able to go on the ground and do the groundwork, but we did use Google Earth Street View to look at what issues from the built environment were causing these issues and concerns. Of course, the downside is that it may not be the most up-to-date. So we do encourage anybody using the toolkit to actually go on the ground and see what's happening in those areas with those crash hotspots. We did also use existing study from the Harvest Hope Park Pedestrian and Bicycle Safety Study, which was shared with us by Sarah Combs, the director of the University Area CDC. So we were able to do a little more digging to identify what some of those issues may have been. And they used a combination of techniques, including a lighting analysis to evaluate safety conditions in areas of concern for bicyclists and pedestrians. We, of course, emphasize deliberate efforts to engage community members throughout the planning process. to identify and involve people from, it is important to identify and involve people from the community early in the needs assessment to help focus the analysis effort and ensure more accurate evaluations. Public involvement techniques should be tailored for the community. And of course, we would use the socio-demographic data collected to develop for the communities of concern map to do that community engagement. There are many engagement techniques that may be used. We identify some throughout the toolkit: community meetings, surveys and interviews, roundtable discussions. I particularly like the storytelling that Dana had mentioned. So there's a variety of efforts and methods that can be used. And it really depends on who the community is and what are the most effective strategies to engage the community. We do include the Transportation Equity Audit Tool, which was developed specifically for this toolkit. It is a survey-based audit tool used to identify the specific needs of traditionally underserved communities. The audit can be completed by agency staff, community organizers, or community members. There are 8 sections in the audit to create a community profile, evaluate transportation conditions, and rank needs. The toolkit reviews some basic steps for the needs assessment or audit, as we refer to it, and staff can engage volunteers to help community members. We also emphasize that using the socio-demographic profile for the community, it is important to identify if there are potential language barriers and solicit the help of a translator if necessary to help minimize any potential language barriers. The toolkit includes methods that can be used to evaluate and the audit results, and prioritize needs as identified through the audit. The process should consider the socio-demographic data collected in the community characteristics section of the audit, and it should be consistent with travel mode preferences relative to each equity category. And you can see some of the strategies that we've identified in the toolkit. And we do recommend asking the community members just very directly, what are your top 3 transportation needs, to get a very clear understanding of what those needs may be. And moving on to the project prioritization. The equity-based project prioritization process is designed to help agencies determine which projects best advance equity and meet the needs of traditionally underserved communities. The prioritization process involves 4 steps. We first define and locate communities of concern, as discussed previously in this presentation. We then select the scoring system and methods, then conduct the evaluation and input findings into the scorecard, which I do want to mention is a spreadsheet-based tool. We developed a version that is completely automated with drop-down. It calculates and ranks once you input project details based on the evaluation. So it's a really cool tool. And then rank and select projects. The process is data intensive or can be data intensive depending on which approach you have and which data you have access to. And it does involve a fair amount of technical knowledge. So for this, we recommend that the process be carried out by agency staff with input from the community. Here's a view of what a portion of the scorecard looks like. It is for use by local and regional transportation agencies and transportation planning with a broader project evaluation I'm all over the place. It is designed for regional transportation planning within a broader project evaluation scoring system or as a separate or additional assessment specific to equity. Here's a look at what the categories are. There are 5 benefit categories and 1 category for burdens. We did find it very necessary to include that category for burdens because a project, although it may help a community, we do want to identify if it will cause adverse impacts and if it needs to be mitigated, or if the project needs to be, or if another project needs to be put in its place, because we don't want the potential for adverse impacts. For example, a wider road that may create a barrier, increase in noise or pollution, anything that may reduce quality of life. The factors and corresponding criteria are provided for each equity category, and there's one factor and criteria for the burdens category. We do provide non-weighted and weighted criteria for each factor. Here's a look at the scoring system. If there is no concentration of communities of concern, the project is not appropriate for this evaluation. If there is a low to medium concentration of communities of concern, the project will receive a score of 1, high concentration, a score of 2, and adverse impacts will be a -10 for each of those for that particular category. The positive scores are, of course, for benefits, and negative scores are for burdens. Each category can receive up to 6 points for a maximum possible equity score of 30. Here's an example of the non-weighted and weighted criteria and how level of impact may be considered. So for the non-weighted, we may just ask, does it improve or expand bicycle or pedestrian facilities, which is very broad question. It can include a number of strategies. For the weighted criteria, we want to know level of impact. We want to know, does the project do more? So does it provide a new protected bicycle facility or shared use path? Does it include signalized crosswalks? Does it significantly decrease walking and biking travel time? And those will receive, of course, more points in the scoring system. They will multiply the existing score by 2. And the weighted criteria might also be changed based on regional or community profiles or needs. The scorecard, of course, can be applied within a broader project evaluation and scoring system, or as a separate or additional assessment specific to equity. So that is just a brief overview of the toolkit. As I mentioned, we are wrapping it up, and it will be available within a few weeks once we submit it to CTED. And the scorecard, of course, is available right now on CTED's website. But they did not include the spreadsheet tool, so that will be included with the toolkit, but you can view the guidance document. So that is it for me.
Thank you.
Everything again, the toolkit, does it include better living in the lower income areas? Because do they have where we can get 24-hour service? Because the purpose of the toolkit is to better the living. How can we better the living in the low income areas? The people that need to work late and they have to work late at night or early in the morning. Do we have a way that we can see the visibility of having 24 hours living like Orlando, Miami? Do we have the way to get better vehicles for people with disability, like the hot plus, the buses? How do we get more people to get more jobs that want to work in the transportation areas? Is there more jobs for more drivers? Stuff like that. We have to look at that. And what is the cost? What is the cost of having better services? All that should be in the toolkit.
Absolutely. We do touch on costs a bit in the, which I wasn't able to show the full audit, but we do identify the cost incurred, and we have a comment box, so it's not just a check all, but are there issues with the cost of transportation, public transit to get to and from essential services and destinations, including employment?
And what about how do we get better limits? How do we get to like getting 24 hours limits? Because
Oh,
people work late and like they work real late. They get how they gonna get do do the job. How they gonna get from the job at 1 o'clock in the morning? They get up at 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning. How are they supposed to get home from the job? What you doing? Let's say you work the late hours, 11 to 7, or whatever. How are you supposed to get home when there's no bus services in the areas?
Right. That is a very important point. And we do include a section on public transportation to identify issues with frequency or time, which can be identified by community members. And we do encourage, once the audit is completed, for community members who have completed it to go to their agency staff or go to their community meetings and say, hey, these issues were identified, and to then, advocate for themselves to say we need more frequent or more variety of bus service times, and here is why. And we also include some resources, so the toolkit can provide information to say, hey, this is how we may address that. This is how some creative strategies that may be applied to include increased frequency, or increase the hours, expand hours, or maybe provide special shuttle services for persons in need of that. So the toolkit does serve as a tool for not only agency staff, but for community members to advocate for those needs, such as expanded bus service, increased frequency, and things that are necessary to get to employment, to get to healthy food, or food stores, and things that we really need to have higher quality of life. So that is an extremely important need.
Fortunately, the toolkit can't solve all the needs. It can help us identify and
Right.
address them more equitably.
Right, and advocate for them. So
in this case, Hart, one of our members and partners, is in control of that, and they are facing serious financial struggles, just like many of us.
Ms. Kretz, you have a comment or a question?
I do, thank you. Tia, that's a very interesting presentation. I'm sure it's been a lot of hard work, so congratulations. I'm wondering for somewhere like downtown Tampa, obviously we have people coming in from all over the community, with downtown being their destination, for the day, for the event, et cetera. Is there a way, do you think, we could use the tool for, even though people might not be living here, but they would be coming here?
I think so, absolutely. We do encourage, for example, staff who may not live in the community to take the toolkit, identify those areas where people live, and where people work, whether it be in the community or outside of the community, and use the toolkit, walk, bike, hop on the bus and take the bus, and identify what works and what doesn't work. So it definitely can work in the same way for people who may be commuting into a community. We just need to be able to, of course, identify them, which may take some creative strategies beyond just the community of concern mapping.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Any other comments or questions? Ms. Boyd, thank you very much for this presentation.
Thank you.
Ms. Silva, do we have any new business?
Not that I'm aware of. I'll just remind people of old business. The sidewalks discussion for the city of Tampa happens to be followed tomorrow. I believe it's item number 4 or 5 on your agenda. And I found the link online, so you too can do that. And our meeting in May is on May 19th.
If there is nothing else that any of the committee members would like to bring before us,
I don't see anything in the chat, and I don't see anybody unmuting themselves, so I think we are
Motion to adjourn.
Okay,
Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.